Hello and welcome along. Last week I did a video on which of the loyalist Primarchs did the most to win the heresy or stop the heresy from happening. So this week I'm going to cover the traitors. So which traitor Primarch actually did the most to win the heresy for the traitors? Now going through this process was actually quite interesting for me because I realised that actually some of the people I automatically thought would be near the bottom were actually nearer the top. And so I think it's going to be quite a bit more unpredictable than the loyalist one, but let's see. So without further ado, number 9, the Primarch amongst the traitors that did the least to win the heresy. And perhaps the most controversial of all, this is Horus. I'll pause for dramatic effect. Yes, Horus. Why? Well, what did he do? Well, on the positive side, he did plan the heresy, sort of. He certainly did a huge amount pre-heresy to get the loyalists into positions where they couldn't intervene against his plans too early, or if they were going to intervene, it would be into traps that he had set. So very, very good use of his power as the War Master to manipulate events within the Imperium to set him up to have the best possible chance of winning the heresy. He did nullify a lot of what the loyalists could do because of those plans that he executed well. However, when it actually came to the heresy itself, things start to go off the rails pretty quickly. So the first thing is Isstvan 3. It could have been so much better for the traitors. So many of their troops died there that didn't need to because he underestimated elements amongst the loyalists within his legion and the other traitor legions present at Isstvan 3. Also, once it was clear that the loyalist elements down on the surface of the planet had realised roughly what was going on and were determined to fight back, he then allows Angron to ruin his plans to simply bombard them into dust by going down trying to personally fight the war hand to hand, as you'd imagine Angron would try and do. But Horus should have easily foreseen that this was going to be Angron's reaction and had some way of stopping this from happening. In fact, Lorgar does a better job of dealing with Angron throughout the heresy than Horus does. So Horus fails massively there. He puts himself into a situation where he can't bombard the planet because he'll kill Angron. And if he does that, he might lose the World Eater's loyalty. And maybe he puts doubts in the heads of his other brothers who might think, well, if he can sacrifice Angron that easily, he will sacrifice us and they might leave him, etc. So he is in a difficult situation, but he allows himself to be in that difficult situation. First by underestimating the loyalists' elements of those legions, and then by overestimating his ability to control Angron. So had he not done that, Isstvan 3 would have been far more successful. They'd had far more troops available to go on through the rest of the heresy. So major fail right at the beginning. The next major fail, well, he sets up this plan to deal with Sanguinius. Now, Sanguinius is his major rival, really, within the Primarchs. He's his best friend, but also the one that should really have been War Master, the one that really Chaos Powers would have liked to have led the heresy. Horus knows this, and he can't get away from this jealousy over Sanguinius, and so he ruins the plan that he's come up with the other traitors, with the Chaos Powers, to turn Sanguinius to chaos. And by doing so, he allows Sanguinius to win the Cygnus campaign and escape with most of his legion intact, not turn the Blood Angels to chaos, which would have been a huge win for chaos. Had the Blood Angels turned, particularly had they turned with Sanguinius as their leader still alive, they would have been a massive boon to the traitors. And probably at this point, the heresy would have been effectively won. He doesn't do that, and he decides, well, I can just take the Blood Angels, but have Sanguinius die. But that interfering in the original plan stops the plan from really working. It makes it possible for Sanguinius to get out of the situation with his legion largely intact. And so, although they are delayed by their time spent in Imperius Secundus, stuck behind the Runestorm, they are still useful at the end of the heresy, which makes it much harder for the traitors to win. A second major fail. Now, he also is responsible for causing Magnus to spend most of the heresy not actually doing anything for the traitors, because of the way he deals with the Magnus problem is having Prospero attacked. And this, of course, pushes Magnus away from the Emperor, but it also pushes him away from Horus, and he doesn't really want to pick either side. And he'd rather not choose either side because he thinks they're both as bad as each other. So Magnus is lost to both the loyalists and the traitors because of the way Horus does that. That's not probably as big a mistake as he makes with Sanguinius and as he makes on Isstvan 3, but it's still a major loss to the traitors, not having the full force of the Thousand Sons and Magnus behind them throughout most of the heresy. Next, the Khan. Well, he completely fumbles that, doesn't he? I mean, he sends Mortarion, a man known for being an absolute, well, insert your own word there, to try and convince the Khan to join him. I mean, and let's be honest, the White Scars were on the brink of joining Horus. A lot of them wanted to. Roughly half the Legion wanted to join Horus. And the other half were there for the taking. Had the Khan said, yeah, we're going to join Horus because he's always been the brother I've felt understood me the most, or I was most close to. He makes a lot of sense. Had it been handled properly, the Khan could have easily taken Horus's side. But it was handled so badly by Mortarion that the Khan turned back to the Emperor, if you like. He was already really renegade in his own mind. He didn't believe in what the Emperor was doing. He didn't like the way he was being treated or the way his Legion was treated. He was really right on the brink of leaving the Emperor had he had some better alternative. But Horus failed to offer him that better alternative. Had Horus done it personally, he could have easily got the Khan onto his side, but he didn't. He sent Mortarion. Now, that is a major mistake again, because he loses what could have been the entirety of the White Scars and the Khan for the traitors, which would have been a huge benefit for them. They would have, again, like with flipping the Blood Angels, it would have been not quite as good, but it would have been pretty close to the same level of benefit to the traitors, and potentially could have been the one move that won them the heresy. But again, he fails. Now, then we move more to the middle of the heresy period, where he just basically goes AWOL. He doesn't do anything. He, after several very big major campaigns that he wins with his own personal military genius, he just kind of gets lost. He gets lost really fighting with his idea of what he is, who he is, how much of himself he's giving to the Chaos powers, and why he's doing this. It really has a mid-heresy crisis of why he's doing this. While he's on this kind of journey of self-discovery, he loses the faith of the Alpha Legion. Well, Alpharius does die at some point. Well, we think he does. And Omegon has always seemed to have slightly different views to Alpharius. So it could be that it wasn't possible to keep Omegon on side anyway. But at least in some sense, this is Horus's fault in not keeping the Alpha Legion on board with the project. He lets Angron and Fulgrim completely lose themselves to chaos and just disappear and go off and fulfill their own desires instead of actually fighting the heresy. So, completely wastes their abilities and their legions. And he loses Curze and Lorgar as well. Curze just kind of loses his mind at the end of the Thramas Crusade and pursues his vendetta against the Lion, essentially disappears from the heresy. Lorgar loses faith in Horus because Horus is being so inept at leading the heresy at this point that Lorgar decides he's going to lead the heresy, which obviously results in Lorgar having to be banished. So he loses Lorgar. Now, he doesn't lose the word bearers, to be fair to him. He keeps them on side, so that's quite impressive to keep a legion on side even though you've banished their Primarch. But he does lose Lorgar, and Lorgar at this stage in the heresy is extremely powerful, a very useful asset to have on board in the invasion of Terra. But because of his behaviour, it really is inevitable that one of his brothers is going to try and take control of the heresy at this point. So, again, that really is down to Horus and his poor managing of the heresy. And finally, he really mismanages Perturabo. Perturabo is very effective throughout the heresy. We'll get to him later in the list. But really, Horus doesn't back him enough. If Horus had given Perturabo more power, more authority, more backing, he could have achieved even more. So, overall, Horus makes several major mistakes that each on their own could be argued to have cost the heresy, but altogether, overwhelmingly, Horus is the one most responsible for the traitors losing the heresy. One last thing, he gets himself killed right at the end of the heresy. When the battle for Terra is really going in the favour of the traitors, they have an overwhelming advantage in forces. He decides to make himself vulnerable for this final confrontation with the Emperor, probably through his own guilt of what he's done, and essentially commit suicide. Now, you can argue that he actually thinks he's going to win, and maybe that's it, but that's just his arrogance. So one way or the other, he makes that mistake. If he hadn't got himself killed, the traitors would have probably won the heresy. They were this close. Again, a major tactical mistake during the Siege of Terra. So Horus, I'm afraid, is number 9. Okay, so number 8, well, this is Angron. As mentioned, he does totally mess up SVAN 3 by just storming down to the planet surface to kill his own men because they've had the audacity to not want to die. And so he gets very, very angry and tries to kill as many of them as he personally can. This, of course, stops them from being just killed from orbit, which means that a lot more of the traitors have to die. So that's the first big mistake he makes. After that, he does actually do quite well in the Shadow Crusade, although, again, it's really only because Lorgar keeps him in check a lot and guides him into the right places. He constantly needs to be managed by those around him to do anything useful, whether it's officers of his own legion or it's his brothers. They're always having to trying to get him to do stuff that's actually useful instead of just rampaging off and killing people. So he's really the definition of a loose cannon. And so, yeah, if you can point it in the right direction, momentarily it's useful because it's very dangerous, but most of the time you're just worried about it exploding in your face. So did very little apart from make major mistakes that made it very hard to fight the Heresy. So next is Mortarion. Like Angron, which I should have mentioned in the Angron bit, was he didn't bring all of his legion with him over to the side of the traitors. A lot of them remained loyalist, roughly a third, I think. Really, a Primarch worth their salt should really be able to convince their whole legion to follow them, shouldn't they? Well, he didn't. And neither did Angron. So there's another mark against Angron's name. Going back to Mortarion, he did help defeat the loyalists at Isfahan 5. He didn't seem to make any major mistakes there, and so that could be in his favour. He was also the main opposition to the White Skulls during early parts of the Heresy, where no one else was really doing much on the traitor side. But he did majorly mess up with the Khan. He was sent to bring the Khan onto the traitor's side, but he did a very poor job at this and just antagonised the Khan and really was a major factor in the Khan choosing to side with the Emperor instead of Horus. He also killed so many humans, which you might think was a good thing considering the goals of the traitors, but it wasn't really, because he killed so many humans on worlds they conquer that those worlds became useless to the traitors. They couldn't build up a base on that world that they just conquered and use it to supply the further campaign. It would just be wasted to them. It was the Imperium couldn't use it anymore, but nor could the traitors, and that actually wasn't very useful. And this was something that Perturabo was extremely annoyed about all the time, because he would be brutal in his conquest, but he didn't kill people just for the sake of killing people. He didn't ravage worlds and leave them useless to the cause. He wanted them to be useful bases to generate more resources to go out for the next part of the campaign. Whereas Angron and Mortarion would just waste worlds. And Angron obviously just killing people. Mortarion trying to literally just poison the worlds until they were completely useless to anybody. So a major mark against Mortarion there. He also goes missing quite a bit during the major parts of the Heresy, not as much as some of his brothers. I think he would be at best neutral if it wasn't for his handling of the Khan and just how badly he did that and losing the White Scars, which was a pretty easy mission. He dealt a major blow to the cause of the traitors at that point. So next we have Magnus. Now, I've gone for Magnus roughly in the middle because he basically doesn't fight with the traitors or for the traitors through most of the Heresy. He doesn't really believe in what they're doing. He's not a traitor, obviously. He was forced into a situation by the trickery of Tzeentch and Horus. He didn't really know which side to pick because he felt like, I hate both sides now. They're both terrible groups of people who have done terrible things. Eventually, he does side with the traitors because he needs to get to Terra, essentially because he wants to get his missing part of his soul back. But through most of the Heresy, he does nothing to help the traitors because he doesn't want to help them. And he actually does quite a bit to help the loyalists. He helps Vulcan get reanimated. He helps a small group of salamanders escape the Runestorm, who are taking Vulcan back to get reanimated. Well, they don't actually know that, but he helps them escape, which eventually leads to Vulcan coming back to life. So that's actually quite a major benefit for the loyalists. He also helps convince the Khan to stay loyal. He kind of does it indirectly, but he does do it, obviously, with a combination of what he says to the Khan on Prospero, but also what Mortarion does to try and convince him. There's a kind of a combination there. He does have a significant role in convincing the Khan to stay loyal. And so those two acts of helping the loyalists probably outweigh most of what he ever does for the traitors, which is essentially help them get their fleet further into the Sol system than it would otherwise have been able to get by creating a massive warp rift. But that in itself does help them. It speeds up the invasion of Terra, but it probably doesn't win the Heresy. It doesn't do as much to help them win the Heresy as keeping the White Scars loyal and getting Vulcan back to life helps the loyalists win the Heresy. So that's why I think he's kind of neutralist. Now, there is one thing you could argue that he did to help the traitors, but he did this completely unintentionally, of course, which was he created the massive warp rift in the Palace Dump where the Webwade project was based, and that led to almost all of the custodians being required to fight demons through most of the heresy, so they couldn't come out and help a great deal in the heresy. And eventually the Emperor, of course, has to put enormous amounts of his own efforts into fighting this war, and the Mechanicum secretly is putting huge amounts of effort into this as well, helping the Custodes, because they're seen as more trustworthy than the Astartes, who the Custodes are worried are going to turn to chaos if they go and fight these demons. So that majorly helps the traitor. All of these resources are being funneled into this battle under the palace instead of going out into the galaxy and fighting traitors. But he did that completely unintentionally. I don't think it's really fair to count that as a helping the heresy. But maybe it is, I don't know. I suppose if you count that, then it puts him up the list a bit higher. But if you don't count that, then I think 6 is about right. Well, one last thing. Some of you will know the story of Magnus a bit better. We're thinking, well, actually, he didn't actually do that. He didn't actually convince the Khan himself. That was a shard of Magnus, or left over on Prospero. And he didn't actually save Vulcan. That was a shard of Magnus that was helping the Salamanders get Vulcan back out past the Runestorm. Well, yeah, but that is Magnus. Magnus is just a collection of his shards. You know, the shards that were on the planet of sorcerers with his legion was also just shards. You know, all of that combined together is Magnus, and each individual one is Magnus. They're just elements of Magnus. So the other thing that a shard of Magnus did, which was become Janus on Terra and help fight Malcador's secret war. Of course, eventually going on to found the Grey Knights. So he did quite a lot during the heresy as Janus. And again, that is Magnus. It's a part of Magnus, but that is still Magnus. And so he did that and probably continued to help the Imperium survive for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years after that. So number 5, Fulgrim. Well, on the positive side, he did kill Ferrus Manus. That was a major blow to the Loyalists. It really shattered the confidence of the Loyalists when Ferrus Manus was killed at Isfahan. So that was a major achievement, really, for any Primarch. It's the first Primarch to kill another Primarch that we know of. I mean, obviously there's the lost Primarchs, perhaps had been killed by other Primarchs. I don't think they were, but it's possible. But certainly this was the first known one, and it was a huge blow to the Loyalist morale. Ferrus was obviously a pretty terrible military commander, and perhaps wouldn't have done them much good had he survived. He was a combat monster. You wouldn't want to face Ferrus on the battlefield, and having him dead instead of alive fighting for the Loyalists was certainly a major benefit to the traitors. So that's in Fulgrim's favour. He didn't manage to bring all his legion with him, though, of course. A large portion of his legion did stay loyal. Again, not great as a Primarch. Of course, he loses himself to chaos very quickly and becomes pretty useless to the heresy quite early on because he's just off pleasuring himself. That's what he spends most of the heresy doing. And so his legion becomes sort of disbanded, goes on their separate ways in small war bands, etc. So he doesn't contribute a great deal because he goes AWOL. He does come back at the end, but largely he doesn't do a great deal. But what's putting him higher up the list than some of the others before him is simply because he does kill Ferrus Manus. Okay, so now we're into the top 4. This was a bit hard. This was where I really had to think about this because there's someone in the top 4 who I was actually quite surprised I'd put here. And this person is above the person I'm about to say now. So Lorgar. Lorgar is 4. So what can we say about Lorgar? Well, obviously he is in many ways responsible for the heresy. He is the first Primarch to turn to chaos. He's certainly up there as a candidate for doing the most to make the heresy happen. But once the heresy actually does happen, what does he contribute? Well, it's still quite a lot. So he does, first of all, he brings this entirety of his legion, or essentially the entirety of his legion with him. Now, he doesn't have loyalists amongst his legion, or at least they're very few individuals. He doesn't have whole sections of the legion that remain loyalist. He does an absolutely massive blow to the Ultramarines at Calth, which really, if he had not done that, the heresy was probably unwinnable. And it was largely him that masterminded that. Yeah, Horus sent him to do it. He gave him permission to do it, basically. But it was largely his plan. He does deserve most of the credit for that, rather than Horus. He also, however, does deserve the blame for not doing it properly. So he had Guilliman at his mercy, he could have killed him. Well, not personally, but his forces could have killed him. But because he actually used Calth as an opportunity to punish the people in his legion he felt were too devoted to Chaos and not enough devoted to him, it meant that they actually essentially lost the Battle of Calth. And yeah, although they did do the Ultramarines massive damage, they also destroyed much of their Ultramarine fleet as well. They did eventually lose when they could have easily won it had he just backed it a bit more. And that would have killed Guilliman, knocked out the Ultramarines entirely from the conflict, and that probably would have in itself won the Heresy, because that would have meant the traitors had essentially infinite time to finish the job and defeat the loyalists at Terra, whereas they were rushing because they were worried about the growing menace behind them of the Ultramarines reconquering worlds that they had conquered before and so on, and slowly eating away the resources that they had. So it put a timer on their need to win the Battle of Terra, which made it harder. Now, Lorgar obviously made that a lot easier for them because the Ultramarines were greatly reduced in capability because of his actions at Calth, but he also is a little bit responsible for them not doing the full job, so that means he's also a little bit responsible for Guilliman being there at all to make this attack. He also does the Ultramarines and Ultramar a lot of damage during the Shadow Crusade. He does a great job at keeping Angron useful because no one else really is doing that. He saves Angron's life, which you could argue is a positive or a negative for the traitors, but I'm going to say on average at this point it's a positive because they've got this enormous monster that they can use to throw into battles and be practically invulnerable. And he keeps the World Eaters useful up to a point. So that's a big positive on his side. But perhaps the most positive thing he did, he created the Ruin Storm, which is the thing that keeps all of the remaining Ultramarines, plus a very large section of the Dark Angels and the entirety of the Blood Angels, plus the Primarchs of those three legions, out of the Heresy for most of the Heresy. So that's a huge benefit to the traitors, and probably one of the most important single acts that any of the traitors do. So that really can't be underestimated how important that is. I would have put him higher up the list because that was so important, but for two things. One is he then tries to take over the Heresy when Horus is kind of fumbling and doesn't do a very good job of it, and so gets banished, and so he doesn't do anything after that. That wasn't great, but that wasn't probably enough to lose him his position higher up in the list. But he also, very early on in the Heresy, he nearly gets killed. At the Battle of Isfahan 5, he is almost killed by Korax. In fact, he's definitely going to get killed by Korax. However, he gets rescued by Konrad Curze. And so that is why Konrad Curze is next in the list. So yes, Curze saves Lorgar's life at Isfahan 5. And because of that, everything that Lorgar then goes on to achieve during the Heresy is really down to Curze. So Curze gets all the credit for everything that Lorgar has done, plus his own positives. So it has to be higher in the list, doesn't he? If he doesn't save Lorgar's life, Lorgar can't go on to create the Ruin Storm. He can't go on to manage Angron through the Shadow Crusade or save Angron's life. He can't do any of those things or destroy the Ultramarines at Calth. That's all Lorgar's credit, yes, but it's also Curze's credit. Now, Curze also does some other useful things. You might not think of the useful things happening for Konrad Curze, but he does. He fights the Thramas Crusade very successfully against the Dark Angels and keeps the Lion and the Dark Angels out of the Heresy for about 3 years, I think, if I remember correctly, which is a major achievement. He also kills Vulcan, effectively. I know, like about 100 times. He has him incapacitated for a very long time, so effectively removing another Primarch from the war for a large period of time. He does also mess up the minds of Sanguinius, the Lion, and Guilliman, really just playing with them while he's on Macragge and they're trying to capture him and or kill him. I can't remember. I think at this point they've just decided to kill him. But he plays with them. It's really hard for them to do anything against him. Now, he does eventually put himself into a position where Sanguinius could have killed him had he not decided he couldn't face killing one of his brothers, which kind of teaches Sanguinius that he actually needs to try and kill one of his brothers. He does waste a lot of their time, but to be honest, they're stuck behind the Ruin Storm anyway, so it's not really changing much in the Heresy. But he could have done more, because when he was there, he really could have killed Guilliman or the Lion several times, but he doesn't, because he wants to play with them, and he likes the thrill of seeing them suffer, having people around them die, and not be able to do anything about it. So he is really sadistically torturing them through his activities. So you could say that's the negative side of him. His madness means that he doesn't really live up to his full potential. The full potential of Curze on the traitor's side, actually trying to win the Heresy, would have been extremely dangerous to the loyalists. And really, the reason his legion fade away and get broken up into small groups is because he fumbles it, because he loses his mind, essentially, and can't lead them anymore, leading to them being defeated by the Dark Angels largely. He could have probably disrupted most of the Ultramar's functions by destroying their government and so on, destroying like manufacturing and training facilities and so on. He could have been the ultimate terror weapon on Ultramar, but he doesn't. So he does fail ultimately, but before he fails, he does do a very significant amount to benefit the traitors. Okay, so number 2. This is Alpharius Omegon. So I had to think about this quite a lot because the Alpha Legion were constantly playing both sides throughout the Heresy, and you could argue that some of the things they did actually made it harder for the traitors to win. In fact, they certainly is the case. We don't know exactly how much of that was Alpharius and Omegon doing with different motives, and one playing off against the other, and how much it was them together deliberately playing both sides. But certainly across the board, they by far did more to help the traitors than they did the loyalists. And so the first thing they did was the intelligence gathering. The traitors were always one step ahead of the loyalists because they always knew much more than the loyalists. They had agents everywhere, and those agents were largely Alpha Legion agents. They were very good at misdirecting the loyalists, very good at sabotaging, and they did huge amounts of this stuff going on in the background that turned whole worlds against the Emperor before any traitors even stepped foot on the planet. So they won large parts of the Imperium through their espionage activities. They almost conquered Terra before the rest of the traitors got anywhere near Terra, and this really only failed because of the Emperor's intervention. In doing so, they destroyed a lot of the defenses of the solar system. They greatly weakened the Imperial Fists, killed a lot of them during this campaign that ended at the Battle of Pluto. Of course, came within a hair's breadth of killing Dawn, and had that actually succeeded, then essentially the Heresy might have been over at this point because Terra's defences were really not ready for this, and most of the loyalist legions that would later return to Terra hadn't returned yet. So there was almost nothing stopping a successful Alpha Legion at the Battle of Pluto going on to conquer Terra and win the Heresy. And of course, he didn't do that, so he's not going to get credit for winning the Heresy, but he does get credit for right up to that point and all the damage he did to the defences of the solar system and to Terra during this campaign. They're also responsible for essentially finishing off the Space Walls. So once the Space Walls had left Prospero, they were extremely battered. They'd taken many casualties, very heavy casualties, and they were very vulnerable. They went to sort of recover, and while they were doing that, they were attacked by the Alpha Legion. And the Alpha Legion were, again, this close to wiping them out. An offshoot of the Dark Angels intervened to help them, so the Alpha Legion leave rather than face both forces together and finish off the Space Walls. But the Space Walls and Lehman Russ with them were this close to being wiped out at this point. And even though they didn't finish the job, they still did massive damage to the Space Walls Legion and their fleet, leaving them even more vulnerable to the next time that they would go into a battle, which of course they would lose when they tried to kill Horus. In another big hand in depleting a loyalist legion, Alpharius and Omegon, through their orders, were also responsible for stopping the Raven Guard from being rebuilt. They find out about the attempts of the Raven Guard to rebuild themselves using this genetic templates that the Emperor's giving them, and they poison the gene seed, essentially, resulting in a failed experiment. The Raven Guard can't rebuild themselves. Not only does this stop the Raven Guard being a force for the Loyalists again, it also pushes the mind of Corax over the edge, and he really doesn't recover from this, and is quite reduced in his capability throughout the rest of the Heresy because he's constantly full of guilt and shame and really can't focus on really just fighting the Heresy, and turns him against some of his own closest people, greatly reduces the effectiveness of Corax during the Heresy. So again, Alpharius and Omegon, they have done a lot there to eliminate another threat to the Heresy. Probably the biggest thing that goes against them is that once Alpharius dies and Omegon takes his place as the sole leader, he does pull out of the Heresy effectively. Now, a lot of their agents still seem to be working in the background, helping the Heresy in the invasion of Terra, but as a main force, the Alpha Legion fleet and the Alpha Legion legionaries aren't involved anymore. That was a huge loss to the traitors. They do have to hold that against Omegon, really. But if you count, I'm trying to count Alpharius and Omegon together as one because it's too hard to pull them apart to see who did what. So on that basis, that is a big negative. But I think they did so much other things that were positive, that they were really responsible for so much of the success of the traitors through most of the first half of the heresy, that they together have to be up near the top. Okay, and number one, well, this probably isn't too hard to guess. It's Perturabo. Everybody knows Perturabo carried the heresy on his back. He is by far the most capable of all the traitors in terms of trying to win the heresy. He does the most. He is the one that's most focused on trying to actually win the heresy instead of messing around doing other stuff like all the others were. He never tries to overthrow Horus, even though he was obviously the person that should have led the traitors. He plans most of their successful campaigns. He actually leads them in person, in fact, most of their successful campaigns. He's responsible for bringing most of the traitors back together to actually go and conquer Terra after Horus loses control of things. He's responsible for planning the siege of the palace. He's responsible for breaking through the essentially impenetrable shielding of the palace. He is responsible for just about everything that's good that happens in the heresy, other than the bits that Alpharius and Omegon did. So he really makes the whole thing work. Without him, they probably wouldn't have got very far at all and would have been defeated quite early on. Had he been a loyalist, there was no chance the heresy was going to succeed. Had he just, not taken part at all and disappeared, well, maybe the heresy could still been won with certain circumstances. Yeah, that's probably true. But he undoubtedly does by far the most out of all of the traitor Primarchs to try and win the heresy. I mean, not least just because he kept trying to win it throughout the heresy. He never loses himself to chaos. In fact, he really didn't like the idea of what his brothers were doing, what they'd become. He just genuinely wanted to fight the conventional war and win it because he knew he could, because he knew that he was actually better than Dawn. That's essentially what it was all about. And he proved it multiple times. And if Horus had just given him more power, more backing, he probably would have won the heresy for him, even with all his other brothers messing up all the time and just doing all sorts of stupid things, disappearing, etc. So yeah, no surprises in number one, but it is, of course, Perturabo. So there you go. That's my list of the 9 traitor Primarchs and who did the most to win the heresy. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, it's good to hear from you. Otherwise, I will see you next time.